solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
Hi, I'm Deepak Jayaraman. I'm an executive coach and I do leadership development work in the space of transitions. I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the Play to Potential podcast, a series of conversations I've been curating for about a year now. As we enter 2018, I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to take stock of the lessons I've learned in all these conversations. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to talk to a range of people, sportsmen like Vijay Amritraj, Vishy Anand, Viren Raskina, business leaders like Zia Modi and Nandan Nilekani, board members like Rama Bijapurkar, Ravi Venkatesan, creative professionals like Atul Kasbekar and Amish Tripathi, and entrepreneurs and venture capitalists like Avnish Bajaj, Dheeraj Pandey and Kartik Reddy. I believe all of us grapple with two questions as we go through our journey: where to go and how to grow. And in my conversations with these guests, I try and get to the bottom of how they've grappled with these two questions at various points in time. It's hard to condense 20 plus hours of material into a few minutes, but let me give it a shot. Let me start with childhood. And my first guest actually was Vijay Amritraj, who spoke about his journey to become a tennis player, a commentator, and then a social ambassador, given his role as a UN Ambassador of Peace. And when I asked him about where the seeds of giving were sown, he took it right back to his childhood.
A little nephew came and said to him one day, can I borrow 10,000 rupees from you? And I'll give it back to you in 6 months as a loan. He didn't have it. He barely had it to be able to give him that money. So eventually he pulled it together and he gave him the 10,000 rupees. And he said, don't give it back to me, but when you get older and someone comes and asks you for it, make sure you give it to them.
Well, there's enough research to say that childhood years are critical in shaping our attitudes later. I was really struck by the extent to which one could be impacted by what happens early on. The other person I spoke to in this context was Vinita Bali, who spoke about her transition across 5 continents and 6 countries. And actually, when I asked her about her leadership style and where it came from, she actually traced it back to her childhood.
So I think it was a combination of all of that and my exposure to the world of theatre, to the world of classical music and dance, I think refined in many ways, my aesthetics or my thinking about things across a continuum, rather than, fragmenting that, this is school and this is extracurricular. In my life, everything morphed from one to another.
It was actually interesting to hear Vinita talk about how she could bring her left brain and right brain into her leadership style and how that was influenced by her early exposure to arts, social impact, and some of the other pursuits. Moving on, I also spoke to a lot of my guests about early career moves. How do they think about navigation early on in their career when they have limited data about themselves and the opportunities outside? And in a strange way, we live in a world of abundance of options. And it's probably all the more important for us to be clearer about how we navigate, especially in our early years. So I want to now take you to a conversation I had with Avnish Bajaj, who's a self-confessed brand collector. He's an alumnus of IIT Delhi, Harvard Business School, worked in Apple Computers, got an internship at McKinsey, and then he was at the point where he was deciding between Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, which is where I asked him about how he thought about the two options. And what he said was something quite interesting.
Once I interned at McKinsey, and by the way, at Matrix, we have a bunch of people from McKinsey, as you know. I think it's a great institution and it brings a lot of training and learning that others don't. But I realized very quickly it wasn't for me. I would have gone to McKinsey if I couldn't get into Goldman. And by the way, there's another side of maybe the personality. It's almost unheard of to get into a Goldman Sachs with no background in finance. So for me, that was a challenge. I would say there is an element of an edge that the Wall Street banks have, which I would say the consulting firms are, and I don't know how best to put it, but a notch lower in it. Maybe it's the aggression. It is the Wall Street culture. The fact that my lifestyle would matter, absolutely would be at the bottom of the priorities for any of the people at Goldman. And even if they knew something could be done on Tuesday, they'll give it to me on Friday evening because that's the rite of passage. I actually really, really learned a lot from that.
It was really interesting for me to see how even the smallest of insights we have about ourselves can play a big role in how we make navigational choices early in the career. Moving from Goddess Lakshmi to Goddess Saraswati, I also got a chance to talk to Kartik Hosanagar, who's a professor at Wharton. And I spoke to him about how he thought about PhD as a career option and what questions people should ask before they pursue a career in that direction.
When I joined my PhD program, I was told that the median time to completion to PhD in my program was about 6.5 years. I was fortunate to finish it in 4, but let's say you take it as 6.5. A tenure path is again 6 to 9 years. So you're talking about committing anywhere from 12 to 15 years to get to the point where you're a tenured professor. But for most of that period, the pressure is on.
I guess every profession has a certain must-have trait. And before you take the plunge, it's worth reflecting whether you have the trait. And it needs to be a deeper reflection, not a surface level consideration. For example, it's a bit like saying, I like ice creams, so I'll go and start an ice cream business. It's not as simple as that. It needs to be a little more thoughtful than that. I spoke to another PhD student who did not pursue a career in academia, Pramath Sinha. He joined McKinsey after his PhD and he went on to become a director and then has subsequently reinvented himself and has become an entrepreneur and has built institutions of repute like ISB and Ashoka. And he had something very interesting to say about how people should think about entrepreneurship as a career option.
Yeah, I like to say this to people, and I learned this in McKinsey when I was there, that I think a lot of people take the entrepreneurial plunge because they're quite taken with the sexiness of their idea. So it's like, it's like saying that I'm going to get married because I'm dating a beautiful woman.
It was really interesting to hear Pramath talk about entrepreneurship as a way of life and how people should actually cross that stage gate in their minds first before they get taken by the sexiness of the idea. Talking about entrepreneurship, I also got a chance to talk to Dheeraj Pandey, who's the co-founder and the chairman of Nutanix Inc. It's a cloud computing company based in the Valley. And we spoke about a range of topics, but he said something really interesting about the notion of anti-fragility and authenticity in the context of entrepreneurship.
This Mike Robbins' idea of authenticity is highly parallel to Nicholas Taleb's idea of anti-fragility. Because they both talk about a spectrum. On the left of Taleb's spectrum is fragile systems.
Right.
On the middle of Taleb's spectrum is resilient systems, which is like honesty. Like, wow, resilience is not good enough. So if you apply pressure to the system and if it goes back to the original state, that's not good enough. Just like honesty is not good enough. So, and both of them apply very similar principles of shock or vulnerability to make it better.
Fascinating.
It's just amazingly fascinating. And this is my epiphany moment that, wow, there are two seemingly disparate things that have the exact same parallels, in terms of the continuum and so on.
It was really fascinating to hear Dheeraj connect the dots across two very different fields, the authenticity spectrum and the resilience spectrum. The point around authenticity was actually underscored by another guest of mine, Abhijit Bhaduri, who's written the book Digital Tsunami. He spoke about the fact that given the digital world we live in, it's become all the more important for leaders to be authentic in their interactions with people.
In the analog world, the leaders were not very accessible, so they would be accessible to a few people and, they would show up for, let's say, some large public event kind of thing, public event or employee event, whichever way you define it. And they would, pretty much come to the balcony, wave to the crowds and then go back. I mean, this is pretty much the model, symbolically speaking. Whereas in the digital world, the expectation is the leaders actually engage in real time with people. And that also means that the leaders are far less curated and polished and, their leadership image is a lot less of that. It's a lot more about authenticity, real time. And this is very hard for people who've grown up in the older mindset, because they need to be seen as perfect when they come in front of the audience.
What happened at United Airlines and Indigo Airlines, I guess, is a great case in point about the need for authenticity at the very top. The other topic I cover with the people on my podcast is around how they built navigational principles as they moved through their journey. A couple of interesting insights here. The first was from Prakash Iyer, who's a fellow IMA alumnus, and he had his initial years of his career in HUL and had a distinguished career in the corporate world and was heading Kimberly-Clark in India when he was at the cusp of taking the plunge into solopreneurship.
There's this interesting story of how Joseph Heller apparently was at this party thrown by an investment banker in New York.
This is the guy who wrote Catch 22.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Joseph Heller was, but a friend of his took him along and said, come, it's a great party, you'll meet all the who's who of the city. And as he went there, it was a great evening, lots of crystal, the finest wine. And as Joseph Heller stood sipping a drink, his friend said, do you realize that our host, the investment banker, probably makes more money in a day than you do than you have in a lifetime? And Joseph Heller said, that's probably true, but you know something? I have something he'll never have. And the friend says, what? And Joseph Heller says, enough. And that's a story that's kind of stayed with me. And in a sense, I think I spent the last few years of my life saying, hey, I think I need to learn to say enough. And the minute I know I have enough, you're sorted.
In the leaders I work with, I find those that have a clear distinction between their needs and wants, having more degrees of option in terms of choices, and also having greater clarity and conviction around the choice they make. The other insight I wanted to bring in here was from Anu Madgavkar, who's also a fellow IMA alumnus. She spent her initial years in the banking context, and then she joined McKinsey as a consultant. And then around the time she had her first child, she took a break, and now she works with the McKinsey Global Institute. She said something very interesting in the context of her transition around maternity.
Because we think about every woman here as a segment of one, right? We are going to solve for you. So let's figure out what it will take to solve for you and make that flexibility happen.
While she mentions this point in the context of segment of one, I guess it's a universal point which is applicable to all of us at various points in time. And if I really overlay this notion of segment of one with the possibilities in the gig economy, I guess it's a wonderful world of opportunities we live in. But as we think about the gig economy, I want to throw in a word of caution, which is an interesting insight from Ravi Venkatesan, who is an alumnus of Harvard Business School and was heading Microsoft in India and Cummins in India, and now is on multiple boards.
One of the problems in this lower and lower transaction costs idea is at some point trust also deteriorates, and then the transaction cost curve starts going back up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So
discovering,
if people don't trust each other, then the transaction cost to establish trust will also start rising. So I think we're reaching a point where there may be that the inflection where it starts climbing again, and then we'll have to find some new equilibrium.
I guess the distinction Ravi makes between the transaction cost of establishing trust and the transaction cost of getting the job done is an interesting one, and we often don't think about it explicitly. So I guess this leaves us with the question, how do we really stay relevant and how do we really reinvent ourselves in this world where there's so much changing? If you found this purposeful, join me in the part 2 of this video, where I talk about some of the insights I gleaned from people like Nandan Nilekani, Vishy Anand, Zia Modi, Amish Tripathi, Atul Kasbekar, and a few more in terms of how they stayed relevant amidst the changing times. Thank you for listening.